Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terrorist hideout in Pakistan. And today I have an excellent guest. It's my good and old friend Josiah Neeley, who works for the R Street Institute now, which is a think tank whose material I read very often and cite very often on Policy Sphere. They do a lot of very good work there. Um, and Josiah's beat in particular is energy regulation. You did a lot of stuff on that at the state level historically, but you're an expert on all things energy and regulation. And of course, energy has been identified as like one of the big priorities of the Trump administration, the new Trump administration. All of the tech guys are excited because it turns out that in order to create AI, you need 500 new nuclear plants. So that has changed the sort of political and economic calculus because now all of Silicon Valley wants some change on this issue. So a lot of very fascinating issues. We were texting before you came on, and I said, "Oh, is there anything in particular we should cover?" And you said the Trump EOs, and I replied, "Well, I mean, I read the Trump EOs. They don't really seem that interesting. I mean, it seems like he repealed a bunch of Biden stuff, and then he said, "Oh, we're going to review energy regulations," which in Washington speak that means nothing, and because they're expecting to do all of the energy stuff in the big reconciliation bill, which is going to come up in March. Am I wrong, or is that?
They did do all that. I mean, they did repeal a bunch of stuff, not just Biden stuff, but stuff that
I
went
guess
back.
the Biden stuff is a lot of stuff, right?
The Biden stuff is a lot of stuff. The probably in terms of numbers, the biggest thing that they did was repeal the so-called Biden EV mandate, because the Biden EPA they had set fuel mileage standards
Right.
for 50% of all car sales in 2030 to be electric vehicles. And, right now, I think last year it was 11%, so that's not nothing. But to get from 11% to
Right.
50% in 6 years, that's a big,
That's a very good point.
yeah,
I'd completely forgotten about the EV mandate. It's
yeah.
because it was so crazy that it's sometimes something is so crazy that your brain just doesn't register it.
Yeah. I mean, it was clear to me. Sometimes you have a mandate, and there's a question of like, okay, well, what's the impact going to be? And for this one, it was clear, like it was gonna go away one way or the other, just because it was the target was so unrealistic, that eventually, like even if Kamala had won, I predict that at some point they would have had to find a way to back off of it because
No, they would just have bought the cars from China.
yeah, well, yeah, well, you could buy the cars from China,
They,
but
the American car manufacturers would have gone bankrupt, and they would just have bought the cars from China. So, and that's
well,
fine.
yeah, but the problem is, there would be no, even if you bought the cars from China, there's no place to charge them because another of
Right.
the administration's initiatives was they were going to build out a huge charging infrastructure, and they spent uh,
Right.
$7 billion and got 9 charging stations,
Right. 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 Right.
and
Right.
the charging stations didn't even always work actually. So that was a problem. The
All
California.
right. Let's sort of pause a little and rewind. So first of all, the EV mandate. First of all, the process bit of it was extraordinary because you would think that in order to say we're gonna ban gasoline cars and everybody's going to drive electric vehicles, like maybe that's good policy, but you would think you would need an act of Congress to do that. Except they didn't get an act of Congress. Instead, they published an EPA regulation that didn't actually said it was an EV mandate. It just increased gas mileage standards to such a level that de facto only electric vehicles qualified. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. So there's an existing regulatory system.
Which is like a mockery of any form of like legislative and administrative process. Like that's not what EPA
That's
regulations.
what it's supposed to be. Yeah. Yeah. So there's fuel mileage standards, so which are determined by the average sales, right? So if the standard is that the cars need to be 25 miles, get 25 miles to the gallon, okay, well you could, in theory, have half of your cars uh, be 40 miles to gallon, and half of the cars you sell are 15 miles to the gallon. I think the math works out there right. I'm a lawyer, so numbers are not the best, but it doesn't like the standard doesn't. It's not a minimum; it's an average, right? So and if you sell an electric vehicle, of course, like because it doesn't use gasoline at all, that allows you to sell a certain number of other cars. So they set it basically so high that the only way to meet it was if half the cars were electric. That's kind of how they did it. And run around that, legally questionable. I mean, maybe the courts would have bailed them out and said
Right.
uh, that they couldn't do that. That's one possibility. They could have been a back down, but yeah. So like that's a big thing. I think that's estimated at like the cost is something like it's close to $1 trillion. It's like $870 billion, right? Was the estimated impact just from that one rule.
Right.
Um, and there's other stuff that they did. They are pausing. So Biden passed a piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes,
Or
I've heard of this one.
Yeah, and it's doubly confusing because it doesn't really have anything to do with inflation. It's so it's called the Inflation
That's
Reduction Act.
crazy. That's crazy. I mean that's
Yeah,
the first time this has ever happened.
no, I know, but so people, I think in general, like people kind of are embarrassed about that, so they just call it. They're like, well, we can't call it the Inflation Reduction Act because that's confusing to people. So we'll call it the IRA, which is
Right. Right.
also a little confusing because
Because it's a terrorist group.
right. I mean, and maybe Biden, as a proud Irish American, maybe that's what they told him. Like, we're gonna give $800 billion to fund the IRA. It's like, all right, let's do it. Um,
We could go on a whole sidebar about how Sinn Féin in Ireland has, which was the political wing of the IRA,
yes,
has become this totally like woke left party that supports like
yes,
trans kids and all that stuff, which is a fascinating phenomenon, but has
right,
nothing to do with the topic under discussion. So I'm gonna just, but it's just very funny. So I'm
right.
just gonna close the parenthesis.
Yeah, right, right. Um, but so there's a lot of money in that that was handed out. Some of it's like through the tax code, but like money. Some of it is like even for good
Yeah,
stuff,
I mean,
like forest
joking
management.
aside, the IRA was like a laundry list of like handouts, and I'm not knocking it. Like it's Washington. It's the way politics has been practiced since the dawn of man, certainly since the dawn of democracy. Okay. Uh, but yeah, it was kind of a Christmas tree,
Right,
and Christmas tree bills, very often like there's some good stuff and then there's some not so good stuff, and there's stuff where you're like, what?
right, right. And so one of the things that was in the EO on energy that Trump put out is, we're just going to stop paying out the money from the IRA, right? Which is, as I understand it, this is something that presidents used to be able to do. It's called
Right.
impoundment, and then
Right. There's a whole constitutional controversy
right,
about it.
and then in the '70s, Richard Nixon was involved in a cover up of bugging the DNC, and so
Nixon did nothing wrong, okay?
okay, all right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, he resigned. Maybe
Yes,
that was his
yes.
mistake. But anyway, as a result of that, they're like, well, we don't want people bugging their political. We don't want the government, the president, having his political opponents bugged, right? That would be bad.
Right. Right.
So, luckily, that has never happened since. But in
Right. So just to clarify for people who are listening who may or may not know about this, basically, so in the American constitutional system, Congress passes a budget which appropriates money that the executive branch then spends, and the president can spend more than what Congress has appropriated. The question is,
well, he
can
can't.
he spend less?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's
And until Nixon, the people were like, yeah, and then after, I don't know if they passed a law or if it
he
was
did.
just
Yes.
yes. Okay, so they passed a law, but it's a constitutional issue, so maybe the law is not the final end, saying no, no, the president has to spend exactly the amount that Congress appropriates. I'm correct,
That is yes. That's what the law
right?
says is that
And then Trump just said, "Well, no, actually, I'm not going to do it."
right. So that's gonna be a legal fight,
Right.
and I think this is indicative. There's a couple things that are in this EA that are like that, where they there's a clear strategy of we're going to be bold and kind of push the limits to see where they are, right?
Yeah.
It's in previous administrations, and Trump won. They didn't do that. Normally you come in and you want to like hedge your actions in such a way to maximize the chance that uh, it won't get invalidated by the courts for the most part, right?
Right.
That's what you try and do. And so you end up kind of tinkering around the edges. And in this case, and this is not just true of energy, obviously, it's true in other areas. I think like with birthright citizenship, other things that are
Right.
outside my ken. But they clearly had the philosophy of, okay, you know, we think we can do more. We think that a lot of these, even if there's a rule on the books that says you can't do X, maybe that rule is unconstitutional. It exceeds presidential authority. Maybe we can get a court, to offer a different interpretation. Let's see. Let's see. Right? We don't
Right.
know that it's going to work, but let's see. So that's kind of the attitude that they are going for. And yeah, I think just like it as an example, in the last administration, there's a thing called the social cost of carbon, right? Which is when they're doing
The
cost
social cost of carbon.
the social cost of carbon. Yeah, it sounds very
That sounds extremely rigorous and scientific. Go on.
right. So it's supposed to be an estimate of like how much damage is done by uh, a given amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and you use it when you're doing your cost benefit analysis, which is something that we all love to do. And in the Trump one, they're like, okay, well, we're going to tweak this. We'll use like a different discount rate. We'll do like they tweaked various things about the calculation to make the number lower. This time they just said, you know what, we're just going to get rid of it. And in fact, we're going to look at coming out with the new rule that says the federal government doesn't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases at all, right? So that's
Oh
just kind of
wow.
like a
So that's in one of the EOs that was signed this week. There's a
correct.
kind of blanket statement that says the U.S. federal government does not have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases.
So there's an existing rule that has to be. It's called the endangerment finding that has to be repealed. And so it basically says EPA look at repealing this rule. It doesn't actually repeal it because it's for complicated technical reasons. It's got to be a multi-step process, but that seems to be what they're looking at,
Wow.
And that's another thing where, you know, uh, that's an Obama era rule. There's a Supreme Court case um, suggesting that they had to do something like that rule, but their court had a different membership then, and I think if you look at votes now, I think they could probably get away with getting rid of it. But we'll find out, right?
Right.
So that's
That's interesting. So going back to the IRA, just sidebar because you reminded me of this, and now I find it very interesting. What was the deal with the charging station? Because you had all these tweets. Is it like they spent $1 billion to get two charging stations in West Virginia, whatever?
yeah.
Like what was that?
Right. Yeah. As it turns out, the government is kind of incompetent at a lot of things, right? So there's some
No,
things.
I fully accept that, but like the mechanics of like how the incompetence happens
Right. Yes.
is, I think, interesting and important. Like
Yeah.
what
Absolutely.
what precisely was the blockage?
Yeah. So you talk to people. There's several things that they cite. One is um, they have to coordinate with a bunch of different people. So they're saying, okay, we're going to build a charging station. We're going to put it on a. Let's say we want to locate it at an existing gas station, which makes sense, right? Because people, okay, so we're
That's
going to
where
do
they
that.
are in Europe.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to do that, but the company that's building the charging station is different from the company that's operating the gas station, and the gas station company is maybe renting from someone else who owns the land. Now, to me, and so they say, well, this is complicated. Working it out takes a long time. Now, to me, this is something that in the private sector, I don't.
Yeah, this is not complicated.
Yeah. But for the Department of Transportation, it turns out, this is something that's very much beyond anything that they've ever had to deal with before. And so they're just
Oh
not
my.
that good at it. And dealing with like local utilities to get like hookups, other things like that, right? So you would think, well, how hard can it really be if you've got a bunch of money and you're the government, so you
Right,
are,
right,
in theory, like in one point of view, it should be easier because you're exempt from a bunch of stuff and you can just kind of
right. I
win it.
mean, this is so you know because usually when people say, "Oh, the government is incompetent," blah blah blah, um, and you look into why something wasn't done or something was late or something was over budget, there's usually a reason.
Right,
The reason is that there's a powerful interest group that this offends,
right,
or there is a pre-existing piece of legislation which is either important or politically untouchable that makes it impossible. Or at the local level, there's just straight up corruption.
right.
Not usually at the national level in advanced democracies, although sometimes you wonder. But
Sure, yeah.
that aside, but you know when you find out that actually no, it really is that the bureaucrats are just like extremely lazy and stupid,
Yeah, right. Yes, yeah, yeah.
and just don't do their work because like the
You
first time
ask-
they hit the roadblock, they go, uh,
Yeah. So it's time for my
and
break.
then they go home for the day. And then the next day they talk about having a meeting about it the week after that, and then it just never happens. Like that's actually not the majority of cases
Right.
when things don't happen. So if that's literally what this is, like, I mean, give Elon the flamethrower. Like,
Well, yes, right, exactly. Well, and the funny thing is, the government had spent all this money to build, nine stations or whatever. Actually, Tesla already has its own
right?
network.
Yes,
Uh,
yes, they
Elon
have a
actually
huge
already
yes.
did it. Yes, yeah. Um, Elon actually already
And
did
like
it.
I mean, I hate like the Euro smug. Ooh, in Europe, blah blah blah. We do it, blah 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 blah. But like, if you stop at a gas station anywhere in Europe, there's the gas thing there, and there's the electric charging thing there. I refuse to use electric cars. I mean, I don't refuse. I just don't like them. But like when we stop for gas, we see that the charging stations they're there.
Right.
They're operated by private companies, which presumably they figure out how to rent a piece of property from the person that owns it. They manage that feat of nuclear physics or heart surgery,
Yeah.
and it's fine.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem like it should be a huge deal, but it is, and it wasn't just with that. I mean, uh, parallel to this, the government also had a big program to build out uh, broadband 5G for
Yes,
rural areas, and they weren't able to accomplish that
yes,
either.
yes, yes,
So I think it is, uh, famously in Obamacare, the big uh, point that they were unable to overcome was not passing the law or redesigning everything. It was building a website. So
right.
I don't know. It does seem like with more competent people, it could have been
Yeah,
done.
no, it turns out to be the case,
Right.
that competence really matters.
Yeah.
But healthcare is actually a good example of the Obamacare website. You're right, that was just straight up incompetence. But in general, the reason why everything in healthcare is crap is because you have very powerful interest groups that make it crap, especially doctors and providers. Um anyway, okay, so anything else in the Trump EOs on energy in the first week that sort of popped out at you? So there's the EV mandate, that's huge. There's the greenhouse gas
Yeah.
thing, which apparently, will get litigated or whatever, but there's at least a statement or a stake in the ground that says we're just not going to do anything about greenhouse
Right.
gas
Yeah.
emissions. Which I mean, I admire the gumption. I'm actually a lib on climate change. I think it's real and I think it's bad, and I think we should do something. We'll talk more about what we should do about it, because obviously the answer is not communism. It turns out,
Right. That's right.
uh, but but I just admire the gesture. It's like, nope, like
Right.
we're just not going to do it. So, like, are we going to regulate air? No, it's air.
Yeah. Well, they still do regulate the air for other stuff, but
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
yeah.
It
Well, maybe they'll look at that. Yeah.
anyway, so anything else in the Trump EOs that sort of jumped out at you and points out that, I was an idiot because I read them and I was like, there's nothing interesting in there, and like you found two bombshells. So, but
Right.
that's why I talk to subject matter
That's right.
experts,
Yeah. I mean, there are.
because we need to listen to the experts.
We need to listen to the experts. That's right. Ich bin ein experts. And I mean, there's some other things in there that I would say are maybe lower impact. There's like restrictions on offshore wind, which it was not what I would do. But offshore wind tends to be so expensive in general that I think in the areas where it was restricted, I don't know that it's going to have a huge impact. The other big thing is, and this is I think kind of feeding into like maybe a broader agenda, is there's
Uh,
a
so offshore wind is, to me, the funniest form of energy.
yeah,
I assume it's complete BS because all wind is BS, but that's not the funny part. The funny part is that, of course, the people who hated the most are also the people who favored the most, because
a lot of
who
people.
favors clean energy? It's like it's rich liberals,
Yeah,
and who owns seafront property whose view is ruined by offshore wind? It's rich liberals, and so it's always hilarious because you always have somebody who wants to build an offshore wind farm, like outside Martha's Vineyard or
right,
outside Malibu,
right,
and like it gets sued into oblivion by like these card carrying members of the Sierra Club and like big Democratic donors who are like, how dare you ruin the view of my beachfront. So, offshore wind, not sure about the energy, definitely 10 out of 10 in the humor.
right, right, right. Um, So yeah, I don't expect that to actually be a big impact, just because in addition to provoking, the sorts of humorous situations that you talk about, it tends to be also pretty expensive. So I
Yeah.
don't like it's not. I mean, as compared uh, as compared to onshore wind, a lot of places or whatever.
Right.
Um, so I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. The 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 whale thing is kind of funny because people have like very
Did you say whale?
whales. Yeah,
Oh yes, they kill whales. Yes, that's
they
true.
make them sad. This is
That I shouldn't laugh because whales are of course like extremely beautiful and complex
yeah,
animals. They
yeah,
have brains the size of this room, and
yeah, but
which is a small
they
room
don't have
because this is
rockets,
a terrorist hideout in the mountains of the Hindu Kush.
right?
But it turns out that there's a correlation between brain size and IQ, and I'm not saying this because of you know
Right,
but
right, right.
so whales are probably like extremely intelligent animals that we should like. I'm a conservationist.
Uh-huh.
I'm a conservationist, he said. No, but like, okay, no, explain the thing with the windmills and the waves because it's absolutely real and it's freaky.
It is. Well, I mean, supposedly the like vibrations and sounds from the turbines can affect like the mood of the whales or whatever.
But
I don't
like
know.
they end up like beaching themselves, right? They end up
I mean,
essentially committing suicide.
whales committing suicide. Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
like I'm not joking. Like they end up beached on beaches in New Jersey. Like I read it. I'm sounding like a crazy person. I read
Yeah,
it on the internet. Damn it, that means it's true.
that's right. I think I'm
But
sure. I mean,
I no, I spoke. I actually, I did even better than read about it on the internet. I spoke to a guy
you spoke to a
who
guy.
told
All right,
me
all right.
that he knew a guy.
Was he a
So
marine biologist?
joking aside, I spoke to a friend who's extremely, he's a very serious person, very successful person, with lots of fancy degrees, and he has family roots in New Jersey, and he told me that this is absolutely real.
Right. So I'm yeah I think there probably were beached whales before as well. So I don't know if someone should do a study to see what kind of effect it's like it is the beached whale rate.
We should study the depression patterns of whales.
Right. Well, there was Elon during the campaign. During one of his speeches, he was talking about how for SpaceX, when their rockets
Yes.
would land in the ocean, they had to do a study on the effects of the landings on
Yes.
whales and I think also seals, where they had to
Yes.
like
Yeah. 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 They had to like put headphones on seals, and
yes, maybe you could do a combined study.
right. I mean, the whole thing is like a cost and benefit calculation. Like if you tell me you're going to give the seals and the whales depression because you're building rockets to Mars, I'm like, okay. If you tell me you're going to give the whales depression because there's more virtual signaling points in building windmills than there is in operating a gas plant or a nuclear plant, I'm going to tell you to take a long walk off a short beer. Uh, so anyway, um,
That's how you get to
okay,
the offshore wind.
what?
Taking a long walk off a short pier is how you get to the.
Yes, it's exactly. Yeah, go to the windmill, but walk there with concrete shoes. All right, so explain Texas to me.
Okay, well, it's hard to explain Texas, but Texas, I guess the way you might explain Texas is to the rest of the United States as the United States is to other parts of the world, Europe or Canada or whatever. Um, so it's just like a big bold state founded by people who came here because they were bankrupt in other places and wanted a new life. Uh,
Okay, so when I said explain Texas to me, I didn't mean like explain the state of Texas to me,
oh,
but like
okay. All right.
okay, so I'm going to tell you what I know, which is I'm sure is sort of very
You're French, Pascal, so I don't
very
know.
very broad and partial. You and I have hung out in Texas.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Bigger than
We
France.
haven't shot guns in Texas yet, but we
We haven't.
shall.
We should.
But I've definitely shot guns in multiple U.S. states. Um, anyway, uh, so Texas, as I understand, has this unique energy model where it's basically like a free for all, and to my mind, to my French mind, to my sort of DC policy wonk mind, that's like saying you can divide by zero because like if there's one thing where you need some sort of regulation
Yeah.
because you have it's infrastructure, right? It's energy, and so my understanding is that they basically like kept their grid totally isolated, so there's no interstate commerce thing, and so they can basically opt out of federal law.
Yeah.
And so like I read this headlines, it's like, oh, Texas built more solar than the rest of the US and also natural gas and also and like and
We got a lot of. We like.
like I understand there's a lot of cheap power in Texas, which if you have a competitive marketplace, prices go down. Okay, fine. Every once in a while, the power seems to go out for a month, which is suboptimal.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just extremely curious because I am a conservative. I am a pro free market guy. If you show me that a market that I previously thought had to be regulated turns out to work fine when it's unregulated, like I'm happy. I want to know about that, but I want to actually know. I'm not a libertarian, so I don't have, I have to put my fingers in the wounds of the resurrected free market and energy before I believe.
Right.
So explain Texas to me.
Okay. All right. So I guess there's a couple things. One, I think we should. You know, I'm a free market guy and I'm a Texas booster, but we do have to be honest and realistic in that when people talk about free market in energy, there's still quite a lot of regulation in of the electricity system, right? So the difference is a lot of place. I don't know if this is true in France, but in a lot of places in the United States, if you move into your home or business, right, and you want to get electricity service, there's just a local utility that does that, right? So you can't shop around. You have one company that you can get your electricity service from, and then that company is what's called vertically integrated, which means it owns the local distribution system, it owns the transmission lines, it owns power
Right.
plants, right?
Right.
Okay, so there's still a lot of places in the U.S. that are
Which is
like
what
that.
it used to be like in France.
Yeah,
And then the EU, meaning Germany, in order to destroy the French energy grid, because they were in the process of destroying their own energy grid, and they didn't want French industry to be more competitive, so they had to destroy our energy grid first.
right.
Forced a breakup between provision and transmission, and I mean, we can talk about it if you want. It is absolutely insane. They just they're destroying like the most wonderful energy system in the world. Um,
Which is the French
and
one?
my bills are twice higher now than they were 5 years ago.
Right.
Um, but thanks to the free market. Um, but anyway, so okay, so in most places in the US, you have a vertically integrated monopoly, which is also regulated.
Yes. Yeah. And so because you have a monopoly, everything about the operations of that monopoly, including what rates they can charge, other things like that, has to be approved by some government body, usually a public utilities commission, right? And
Mhm.
Um, see, that's the way it
Which,
used to
by
be.
the way, is totally fair because if you have a government monopoly, the price system
Yeah, if you
doesn't
didn't have
convey
that,
information. And so it doesn't have, the reason why price controls are bad is because the price in a free market, the price system conveys information about supply and demand,
right,
which is how you uh, uh, you get things to be efficient. But in a regulated market, prices don't convey that sort of information. So that you don't destroy something by changing the prices.
right.
I just said something about Medicare. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Yes, right. Yeah, you need it because otherwise the monopoly, since you don't have a choice, they could basically charge whatever they want, and you're kind
yes,
of stuck with it unless
yes,
you want to go back to burning logs on the fire,
right.
or whatever. Um, so that's the way it used to be everywhere in the US. Now the system has gotten a lot more complicated, and not just Texas. There are, I think, about 13, 14 states that are what is called restructured. And so that means that you, as an end user consumer, do have a choice of who your provider is. And it also means that there's competition in the generation market. So instead of having a utility that owns all the power plants, uh, different companies can build power plants and then they sell the power onto the grid that everybody else uses. And Texas, so Texas is not unique in that we go further than any other state in that, I would say, because other states, even the ones that have uh, retail choice, they have all sorts of different backstops and other things, and ways in which the monopoly still kind of encroaches into the system that you don't have in Texas. Um, our system is, it's not perfect, uh, but actually, I think we do have a pretty cheap, reliable system here. So I definitely, I'm a fan of it. I'm a booster of it. Um,
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand. So during the 90s, which
yeah.
was, during the heydays of neoliberalism, there was this theory about, how to improve those sort of natural monopoly public services, energy being the biggest one, telecommunications, trains,
Yes.
um, and the idea was exactly you're going to separate the infrastructure layer from the service layer, and then we're going to have competition at the service layer, uh,
Everybody wins.
and everybody wins. Blah, 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 blah. It turns out it didn't really work that way because for a bunch of complicated reasons. Because sometimes you do still have local monopolies. So, for example, when the Brits did this with their rail system, they essentially like created like regional monopolies, and so they ended up with like a sort of like socialist scare story where privatization led to higher prices and worse service quality because you just had these local monopolies that
Right.
fleeced their customers. And meanwhile the rolling stock got worse because the company or government utility or whatever that run the infrastructure was no longer getting the money from the tickets, and so the underlying infrastructure got worse. um and so you can take many examples. So in France, they did this, which doesn't work at all because the grid and the provision are just like intertwined like this.
Hmm.
And so basically, what happens is that EDF, which is the traditional government utility, uh, is mandated to sell its power at a discount below cost to its competitors so that they can sell them off to the public.
Yeah.
And so it, it's just a disaster. So is basically it's just very tricky to implement in practice. They're doing this for trains in France, which again is a disaster because like Amtrak, there's like 3 or 4 profitable lines that basically like subsidize the rest of the network. and the train utility like made a bunch of money on those lines, and that subsidized the rest of the network, which is worth subsidizing for sort of public common good reasons. And now, of course, you have Deutsche Bahn and Trenitalia, blah blah blah, offering like 5-star train service from Paris to Lyon, which is the equivalent of like New York to Washington, and basically like cutting into the company's profits. So within 10 years, the French train system is, which now is still the envy of the world, is going to be garbage. So is that basically the Texas model?
About the trains. Well, I would say so. I agree with you that it's important. It can be tricky, and it's important to.
I guess my question is how at what level does the competition happen? Is it just the service? Is it just the consumer endpoint, or is it
No,
the
so
grid?
yeah,
Because like the grid is the grid, yes.
yes. So the in turn. All right. So transmission
Feel
and
free to talk to me like I'm a sixth grader.
yeah. So if you
No,
think
I'm serious.
yes, yes. All right. Shut up, sit down, do your homework. The
That's very good advice.
Yes, that is a good advice. Yeah. Um, so if you break up the grid into like three components, right? So you have the power plants, they make the
Yes.
power. Then you have transmission that moves the power from one place to
Yes.
another, and then you have the distribution system, which is the actually delivering the power to your house once it gets to you, and you've got
Okay.
yeah. Um, the in Texas, the distribution and the transmission system are still basically monopoly regulated,
Okay. Okay.
and the generation is where you have competition.
Okay. All right.
And one thing that we did, which is different from a lot of other states in the U.S., is we made like a hard break, right? So in a lot of other places, even if they have competition in generation, they'll say, well, the distribution company can also own generation and participate in that market. And I think what we found is that creates a bunch of problems. I think like what you're talking about there, where the utility is forced to sell power to someone else below
Yeah.
cost, just separating it out so it's like they're not competing with each other anymore. They're doing totally separate things.
Right.
That we found, is a good way to avoid those sorts of problems, right?
Okay. Got it. Okay. Got it. That was very clear. Okay.
All right.
So let's say um I want to build a solar farm in Texas.
Yeah.
Very easy for me to get a permit.
Yes.
Plenty of land where there's lots of sun.
Yeah.
Sounds like a very good business proposition. Okay, I build my solar farm. Um, what? So I sell it into the grid.
Yes.
There's a distribution monopoly company. Uh, what prevents that company from saying, "Look, I'm just I'm just gonna pay you like the lowest possible price. I'm not gonna pay you uh because I have a monopoly customer.
Hmm. Yeah.
How do I make a profit? I guess is my question. How does the price, because again, the point of competition is that it reduces prices, right?
Right.
But if you have a monopoly buyer,
Yeah.
you don't reduce price because there's, or potentially you don't reduce price because there's innovation in the marketplace or whatever. You reduce price just because you force people to sell you at a price where they basically don't make any money,
Yeah. Okay. So
or they sell you at a price which doesn't reflect economic realities. It just reflects monopoly.
mhm. Yeah. Okay. So there's kind of two stages for this, right? Wholesale and retail. Okay.
Yeah.
So at the grid level, basically they hold the way that the prices are set is they hold an auction. So they say the grid operator says okay, we need this much, let's say we need 70 gigawatts of electricity. Who can provide it to us? And all the
Right.
different plants will say, I can do it at 2 cents a kilowatt. I can do it at
Right.
1.5 cents a kilowatt, blah, 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 blah. And they
Right.
basically
So it's an
they take,
auction.
yes, they do. Yeah, it's a reverse auction. And uh, so that's how the wholesale prices are set. And then an individual provider, right, says, okay, this is how much money, this is how much electricity I need. They buy it off the grid at that price, and then selling it to the end user customer, they have some sort of contract.
Okay.
Usually, it's for like a set. Usually, they have like a fixed rate, that
Okay.
they're doing, or something else like that.
Okay.
To because an individual, like, granny or person with a family or whatever, uh they don't want to be following, the wholesale market prices, which can like
Right.
swing up and down. They
Yes.
want something that's,
Yes.
they don't have to think
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. And there's like lots of stuff about hedging and all of that.
Correct, yes.
Uh, okay, so that's great. Uh, why is it that when it snows in Texas, which I agree is not often,
Yes.
but does happen, why is it that when it snows, all the power goes out?
Right. Well, so one thing.
With this wonderful free market where you have dozens of providers, you've got the guy with his solar farm, the guy with his gas plant, the guy with his windmills, all competing to provide.
Right. So the electric grid in most places, it's designed around the peak, so
Yes.
because we don't store electricity on any large scale. I mean, there's some ways to do it. You can do it with like hydro, or to some extent batteries, but for the most part, power has to be generated basically while it's used.
Yes.
So that means that the time of day and even the time of year when you use the most power, a lot of the grid and thinking uh, goes into making sure that you can get as much juice out of the system at that moment, right? Which
Yeah.
for Texas, it's typically afternoons in the heat of summer, right? That's
Yeah.
when you want. That's when you need the most power. So our our power plants, our grid, everything was designed for that. And the problem is, the way you build a power plant to optimize for summer weather is different than how you would optimize something for winter weather, right? Because
Okay.
you want power plants, they generate a lot of heat, and you don't want them to overheat. So you want heat to be able to dissipate when it's really hot, but if it's cold, you need to be able to like keep heat in, or have stuff to like protect you from the elements. That actually can
Uh,
make it harder in the summer.
so
So
hang,
yeah, okay, all
fifth
right,
grader.
yeah,
Uh, okay. You design your grid for the peak. Okay. I recently learned that France still has and always had coal-fired power plants, but only for the peak, right? Because that's
right.
that's the one downside of nuclear, which is it gives you this all the
It's very,
time.
yes, yeah,
And so we have like 5 coal-fired power plants that we turn on like twice a year because like the one thing about coal is like you turn it on like this and it just provides energy right away because
right,
literally you just shovel thing into the fire and it gives you energy. Um, so okay, but why? Country A,
yeah,
same power plant, same grid, blah blah blah. Very cold.
yes,
There's peaks of energy consumption because people are heating their homes. Country B, same grids and blah blah blah. Very hot country. There's peaks of energy because everybody's using air conditioning. Like it's the same idea. Like when you have extremes of temperature, people use more electricity,
correct,
but
yeah.
it's still
It's still
the
electricity,
electricity doesn't know that it's going into an AC unit versus a heater. I mean, or
yeah, but
again, very sixth grade level question. Um,
um, well, maybe this is an analogy. Okay, so if you want to put like, I had to refill. the windshield wiper fluid on my car recently, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, but if you go in to buy windshield wiper fluid, you find that there's like two different types, right? There's a cold weather type and there's a warm weather type, right? For if it's freezing out or if it's not.
Okay.
And I don't know a lot about the chemical processes used to make this, but apparently there's windshield wiper fluid. Its performance depends on what the weather is, right?
Okay.
You want to do
Okay.
freezing. You want to have some like antifreeze in there so that when you put the windshield wiper fluid, it doesn't create a coat of ice on the front of your car.
Okay. Okay.
That antifreeze doesn't is going to make it perform less well when it's not freezing. Okay, so,
Okay.
similarly with a power plant, in wind turbine, gas plant, whatever, if you build the power plant to optimize the amount of juice that you're gonna get out of that power plant, you're gonna want to know what are the weather conditions going to be like, because
Okay.
to protect yourself from the cold, you're making the plant more inefficient in warm
Okay.
weather and vice versa.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so if you okay, so it's the plant, it's not the
Yes.
grid, it's the plant. So if you build a gas plant in a hot country,
Yeah.
you're going to design it in such a way that it produces more energy in warm weather, but if it snows, it shuts down.
Right. Right.
And vice versa, if you're building a gas fired plant in Norway, um, which you might, uh, you're gonna like weatherize it or something.
Correct. Yes.
And the downside of that is that if there's ever a heat wave in Norway, the okay, that's fascinating.
Yes. And
Um,
it's not
we
totally.
can say hello to my co-host, whose
Hello,
name is Vesta,
Vesta.
and
Yes.
she likes to join sometimes.
I assume
Yes,
she does not
yes.
have kids if her name is Vesta.
What?
The dog, if it's named
Yeah.
Vesta, I assume the dog does not have kids. It's not a mother.
No, she's too young to be a mother.
Okay. All right.
Although the boys are starting to show interest, she's at that age.
Oh.
Um, but no, she doesn't have kids yet. I'm lobbying to be able to breed her, but my wife says no. And um,
Well.
to breed a dog, I found out because this is France. If you want to breed your dog and sell the puppies legally, there's like a million forms you have to fill.
Right. I'm sure.
Um, and I if I was to breed her, I wouldn't keep all of the puppies. I would just keep one or two,
Sure.
and I would
And you
prefer
eat the rest.
not to kill the other ones because I mean, I grew up on a farm. I'm not squeamish, but I would prefer not to. So
Right.
we're probably not going to breed her.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Can you are you allowed to give the puppies away or sell them to other people, or do you?
Well, I mean, it's always like, I mean, if I put an ad on Facebook and say, here are some Labrador puppies for 200 or whatever, and like, am I going to get arrested? Probably not. But
Right.
I'm an idiot, i.e., a responsible citizen.
Right.
So I like to stay within the law. Also, she's a yes, she's a pure breed, isn't she? Isn't she?
Right.
Yes, because we believe in racial purity around here, at least for dogs. Um, and so in order to get the paper, if we were going to breed her, in order to get the paperwork that shows that blah 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 blah, which would increase
Here's your
tremendously
value.
the value of the. Um, she's just a great dog, and I would like to own one of her children, but if you think about the details in the logistics, you realize that it gets a lot complicated. Again, if we were living on the farm, I would just breed her and like drown the puppies because that's the way our grandparents did it.
Yes, that's right.
Let's be honest for a second.
Yes.
But I'm a lib, and so I would prefer not to do it that way. All right. All right. So I think I understand Texas now.
Okay, great.
What what's the benefit of this approach? Is it so there's a lot more diversity of power generation. That's you
Yes.
can you can think of it as a good in itself because it sort of creates resiliency, it creates, innovation. You have solar entrepreneurs over there and wind entrepreneurs over there and gas entrepreneurs over there, and that's intrinsically a good thing. Okay. Do you have lower prices?
Yeah. So traditionally, we have had lower prices. I think we still have below average prices than the rest of the nation. And I think when I've looked at um, the research, the science on it, it does look like competition has saved us quite a bit of money uh, to consumers over the 30 years or whatever. So that is definitely a big advantage. And the other big advantage I think that has come from this is one thing that tends to happen when you have a monopoly is they get kind of set in their ways a little bit. They know
Yeah.
what works for them, and that can be fine if you're in a industry or area that's not changing that much, right? But with energy, with electricity, there's so much potential for change now that having a more competitive system allows for people to take more advantage of that. And I think you're seeing that now. Like, for a long time, electricity use in the United States, in most parts of the United States, was either flat or declining because like all of our devices and everything were getting a lot more energy efficient, and we were kind of deindustrializing. The U.S. was a little bit, so we weren't making as much stuff, and population was still growing, but not at a huge clip. So for all those reasons, like, you basically, the demand next year was going to be about the same as this year and the same year after
Right.
that. And now, between AI, data centers, crypto, EVs a little bit, and reindustrialization, the projections are that
Right.
demand is going to go way up, and
Right.
that's fine. But you need a more nimble system to deal with that, because you got to be able to build a bunch of stuff. You got to be able to hook it up
Right.
and
Right. Right.
accommodate it at all. And so I think a system with some competition in it is going to better handle that than some other places where you talk to people in other parts of the country, about like data centers or whatever, and they're kind of scared of it because they're like, well, we can't have more demand. We can't have like new factories. If the factories reopen, like, how are we going to power them? um that's not I think that's I don't think that's the question that a successful country is going to be.
Okay, so basically, if you want to build a factory or a data center, you have to do it in Texas or France and nowhere
Right,
else.
right. Yeah.
That's yeah. All right. Well, excellent segue to because okay, we're gonna have a huge demand increase in demand for the reasons you
Yes.
cite. So I have two words on my notes, and we can take them in turn. If you want to do one in particular before the other, that's up to you. I have nuclear and NEPA.
Right.
So which one do you want to do first?
Well, let's talk about NEPA, about permitting.
Oh, I'm sorry, NEPA.
NEPA, yeah. I mean, it's all right. You're French. One of the things about
Le NEPA.
being a foreigner is you're allowed to pronounce words however you want, and we just assume it's part of the accent, so you don't have to worry about that.
All right. So, all right. So NEPA. Let's go.
Okay,
So,
so
uh, framing this, basically. So I forget what the exact words thing. but it's like National Environment Something Act, and it regulates what you can build in a bunch of domains, including energy. And one of the biggest problems with NEPA is it allows a bunch of people to sue, to either petition the government, the EPA, blah blah blah, or to outright sue if they have any reason to believe that any given project is going to damage the environment. And the problem with that is that, of course, there's, lots and lots of NGOs, interest groups, and so on and so forth, whose full-time job is to do NEPA lawsuits and to essentially stop projects. And so projects have to go through like 5, 10, 20 years of red tape before they can get built.
Yeah,
Okay. Is that a fair
I
summary?
think that's yeah that is that is basically right. We had a period in the United States, especially after in the decades after World War II, where we just built a lot of stuff. Right, most of our
Yes.
infrastructure, it like a lot of it dates from that period,
Yes.
and a lot of that I think was really good. But there were some issues that, in retrospect, I think they caused kind of a backlash. Even things like urban renewal, slum clearance. This was it's all part of the
Right.
same mindset. So the
Robert Moses.
Robert Moses, yeah. So in the early 1970s, one of the things they did is they said, okay, before you issue permits for some sort of new building project, you have to do an environmental impact analysis. So you basically have to say, what
Right.
is the impact of this going to be? What are the alternatives? How can we minimize impact? And interestingly, it's not itself a substantive requirement, right? In that you can do if you do the impact analysis, it's not like you necessarily have to reach a certain result in order to be able to do the project, right? So you could be like, yeah, we've
So
decided,
legally, you can say, yeah, it's totally gonna kill the spotted owl,
right. Well,
screw the spotted owl, but I'm just gonna build it anyway.
yeah, I mean, endangered species is a separate thing, but yes, basically. Uh, and at the time, uh, when this first started, it was thinking, okay, it's not like you're going to do these reports. It'll take a little while, but it won't take a huge amount of time. However,
Right.
as you noted, what happens is if you do the report and then an environmental group or someone can sue you and say, hey, you didn't consider this or you didn't
Ah.
properly do that. And uh, so as a result, over time, in order to protect themselves from the lawsuit, preparing these reports, the reports get longer and longer, and the time it takes to make them gets longer and longer, which slows down all the projects, which is the point, because with a lot
Yes.
of these groups, their goal is not to win necessarily, it's to delay, because they believe
Yes.
delay is life. And oftentimes it is. That's a Lawrence
Well,
King's word.
so I mean, the problem with delays is that anybody who's done a discounted cash flow analysis, the further back you move the moment when the money from your investment starts coming in,
Right.
the higher the discount rate, because you have to apply a discount rate to the cash flows, and the further back in time it is, the higher the discount rate, and so the lower your ROI is, and so projects become economic, and so it becomes rational to just not do it.
Yes. So a lot of projects, I think we don't see a lot of some of the negative effects of NEPA because there are a lot of projects that people don't even consider
Yeah.
anymore because they just know like this like it's not worth it to wait 10 years, in order to figure all
Yes.
this out, right? And then of course even the people who are dumb enough to actually try and go forward with the project, oftentimes, after 10 years they kick themselves.
Their investors pull out.
Right, yeah. So that's a big problem, and it's getting progressively worse over time. It did get a little bit better under the Trump 1 administration. The times came down a little bit, but then they started going back up under
Right.
Biden. And so this is, I think, this is a rare instance of what you still call like a bipartisan issue where there are uh,
Yeah, there's like some pro-growth Democrats
right. Well, and it's
that are
yeah, they're pro-growth Democrats, and then the other thing is, it was one thing when, in terms of energy, when the projects involved were like fossil fuel related, uh, people were like, well, who cares? But now, because there are a lot of clean energy projects, wind, solar, whatever, they also are facing NEPA problems. And so people who before were not that sympathetic now are starting to think, well, maybe actually NEPA is a problem if you like we're gonna do this build all this renewable energy to save the planet, but actually it takes 10 years to build a transmission line, and
right. I
because
mean, we've got to build all that offshore wind
gotta
because
build an offshore, right.
right outside of Barack Obama's house on Martha's Vineyard,
The NEPA,
um,
the
in
environmental
in
impact,
the white section of Martha's Vineyard where he lives.
the white section, yeah. I'm
No,
sure the environmental.
that's not a joke. There's a black section in Martha's Vineyard, and
Oh, is
that's where
there?
he decided not to live.
Okay, I'm not.
It
I've never been to Martha's Vineyard, so I don't know about the racial demographics of it. But
that's like a very revealing thing about the kind of person that Barack Obama is, which is he's not he doesn't identify with actually with the African American community in the U.S.
uh-huh.
He has high melanin in his skin, but he doesn't actually think of himself as like a black person. He thinks of himself as a white liberal who grew up in Hawaii. Anyway,
Yeah, all right.
so Barack Obama lives in the white section of Martha's Vineyard, and we should deregulate so that we can build like a huge curtain of
Yes,
very tall windmills, like
yes,
right outside.
that's right. Yeah. So I mean, that's a problem.
That's the most pressing issue
But
in
the most
energy.
pressing issue right now, President Trump, if you're listening, and I know you are, um, we got to deal something. Actually, JD's listening. He can tell Trump about it. But,
I I mean I assume if you're in the West Wing, you don't have time to listen to podcasts, but there's probably like people who know people in the West Wing who are listening.
yeah. Well, I will say I do know that JD, at least during the transition, he did have time to listen to podcasts, and he was listening to uh, some of them. So, you know,
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. Now that he's vice president, I'm sure his the days of the vice
I
president.
mean, if you're vice president, you're basically unemployed, right? You're
Right, yeah. Bring
that's
home
what
the
the
big
job
dollars,
is,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So he's basically I take it back. He's probably like listening. That's probably all he does.
Yes,
That's
that's right.
probably all he does.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like,
Forum.
come play with the kids. No, I'm doing, national security briefing.
Right. Trying to get good at Diablo or whatever.
Yeah, he's playing online games with Elon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So anyway, I hope
right. So
this is
jokes about Barack Obama and JD Vance done.
fun. Yeah.
Yes,
Check.
yes. Petting the dog in progress. So what? So I guess two questions. So you had a bunch of NEPA reform bills, especially during the lame duck,
Right.
around trying to sort of figure out workarounds.
Yes.
So I guess two questions: like, what's the dream scenario, the dream reform, like a straight repeal or something, and like, what's the most likely thing that's going to happen?
Yeah. I think. I don't think just getting rid of NEPA is in the cards. I would say. But I do think one of the things that they need to look at is who has standing to bring some of these
Right.
lawsuits, right? and working like on the litigation piece of what
So
exactly.
explain the standing issue more
Yeah,
precisely,
I
because
mean,
it's
if
a huge
you're,
deal.
I mean, if like let's say that the government wants to build a highway through your house, right, or through,
Yes.
then you could say, okay, you as the
I hope they do.
yeah, yes,
It's
they do,
really ugly.
yeah. Um,
Also, they have to pay me like a ton of money.
Right, right. Um, you as a landowner, clearly you're affected by that, so you would have standing to challenge it. Okay, but
Right.
uh, the standing in uh, these cases, because we're dealing with environmental stuff, the frog or the trees or whoever, uh, they don't have standing, but people, these environmental groups, they can have standing basically on behalf of it. It's like I
Because
like
they
to look,
commune with the trees,
right,
right?
exactly. I like
Uh,
looking at the trees
Unlike capitalists who hate
who
trees.
hate trees. Well, capitalists love trees, they because they can cut them down. But uh, I
By
mean,
the way, I mean, I'm sure you know this, but like this is a true fact that logging like increases the total
correct.
amount of, because people
Yes,
plant more than they anyway.
there
Yeah,
are
so
other
basically if you're, people who are directly affected by a project can sue to
right.
stop or amend it or whatever. Okay, that fair enough. That's America.
Yeah,
Everybody's got a right to their day in court. But like some environmental NGO in New York or San Francisco can sue to stop a project in Nebraska just because they don't like it, and they're green, and 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 they feel like it. And again, like as you say, in theory, okay, somebody's going to be there to speak for the trees, but in practice, because you have a million of these NGOs who are funded and whose full-time job is to look for these lawsuits to do, it just means that, whenever you try to build something, you get 11 lawsuits. So the issue, that's the standing issue.
yeah. And then there's also a question of what do they have the right to challenge? As I mentioned, in terms of like these impact statements, you know, it's like completeness. Like you were going to build a highway, but you didn't consider the alternative of having a footpath, or gondolas or whatever. And so, just having some stricter standards for that, I think, would be useful. One thing that people have, some of the reforms have proposed like time limits, like the report has to be done within a
Right.
certain amount of time or whatever. But if you don't limit the ability to sue, you don't create standards for what they can sue on, that's not going to help you, because then they'll just like they'll do a rush job, but then they're guaranteed to get found deficient in court because they weren't able to like cover everything.
Right. 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 Right.
And so the court will say, well, go back and do it again. You're not actually saving any time.
Right.
Um, so that, and then exemptions, right? There's systems for like, you can be exempt from some of the requirements. I think in the executive order, they maybe expanded some of that, like for what is exempt from some of the stuff. So that's probably those are the sort of avenues where I think you'll probably see some action, hopefully, to try and get the timeline
Okay.
to a more reasonable amount.
Okay, great. Let's do nuclear.
Yes, speaking of reasonable timelines,
Yes, yeah. Um, so we were saying, oh, if you want to build a factory someplace, you should do it either in France or Texas. I believe that last year, like you only had two places in the world that put online new nuclear plants, and they were literally France and Texas. I read something like that, or was it North
Well,
Carolina?
so there are,
But basically, there's been like, I mean, maybe excluding China or something, but certainly in the rich world, you had like two places that are doing new nuclear, and it's France and the U.S.
yeah. So there's a number of new nuclear projects that are going on in the U.S. I think the thing that happened in Texas was a microreactor, which is kind of where there's a lot of energy is now of Instead, like,
So like the small reactors.
yes. Now, a small
Okay,
reactor,
so let's go back.
yes,
Why haven't we built any nuclear for the past 50 years?
yeah,
In France, the answer is because we haven't needed any,
right.
but that's not the answer in the US.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two issues or challenges for nuclear building new nuclear, and they're related. So people kind of debate over to what extent they're the real problem. So the first one is regulatory, right? So the process of getting a new nuclear plant up online and licensed and everything. I mean, we thought NEPA was bad, but
Yes,
NEPA is a walk in the park compared towards the Nuclear Regulatory Commission
right,
and all of that. So that's a huge problem. Just getting it, the designed, approved, all the safety stuff or whatever. The second question issue is economic, right? So nuclear plants, they're very costly, right? Huge
yes,
capital expenditure up front. And then once you've made that capital expenditure, in order for it to pencil out, you have to like make the money back slowly over 40, 50 years. And it's hard to predict electricity prices that far out. There tend to be swings, and
right,
nuclear has had a lot of trouble competing. First
right.
with natural gas, and
If only there was an entity that could borrow at very low interest rates,
yeah,
and had an interest in like ensuring infrastructure and like public goods. I'm just throwing it out there.
yeah. I mean, I guess even from the standpoint of a public entity, if you're a public entity and you have a choice between spending money to build a nuclear plant or spending it to build a gas plant, it's not immediately obvious why you would prefer the nuclear plant.
Right.
There's some advantages that nuclear has over gas, right? It's carbon free, all right. So if that's something that's important to you,
It's carbon free. It's you well, speaking of difficulty predicting prices,
yeah,
you're not hostage to the vagaries of the global
right.
commodities markets.
It doesn't require a fuel, so the way that gas does, or even coal. You got to source the coal from somewhere.
Yes.
So there's advantages to it, but there's also a
Yeah,
drawback.
but I mean, there's the people shared this clip of Nick Clegg. You know who Nick Clegg
I
is?
do,
So
yes, I remember
yes,
him, Mr.
um,
Liberal.
he was interviewed when he became deputy prime minister of the UK, and they were talking about energy. He says, "Why don't you build nuclear?" And he says, "Oh, there's no point. It won't come online until 10 years." And of course, now we're 10 years later, and like,
Right,
so people are resharing that clip, going like, "Oh."
right,
We
right,
would have literally we would have it now. And of course, now Nick Clegg, is no longer in office. He made a bunch of money at Facebook, and so
so who's laughing now?
from I by the way, I actually really like and respect Nick Clegg as a person. He's a center left guy, but he's like a wonderful guy personally. But like he did the rational thing as a politician, right?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, so those are I think the two big challenges that you face. The one thing is, regulatory. It takes a huge amount of time to build it, and then the other one is just in terms of the economics. For right now, nuclear doesn't seem to be all that competitive with other energy sources, right? And even a lot of existing nuclear plants have had trouble remaining online because they're competing with lower cost natural gas for the
Interesting.
yeah. So some of the price, of course, feeds back into the regulatory process because regulation costs. There's a dollar value cost to regulation having to go through that whole process of permitting.
Right. I mean, the problem slash positive of nuclear is that it costs a lot of money up front, but it costs very little money to run. Like, again, I don't mean to like bash you over the head with French stuff, but like the French electricity is famously cheap, and which is why the Germans, literally like everybody else buys it. Belgian, Italy, it's there's a website that sort of tracks live sort of energy consumption net, and like you go every morning, and like basically like people when people wake up, you've got France that's bright green because it's exporting energy, and like literally all of the countries around it are red because they're all importing the energy from France. Like when people get up in Germany, all of a sudden,
Yeah.
so okay, so nuclear, a very, very high upfront cost. My point earlier about, government borrowing at low interest rate. I mean, I wasn't joking. Like, this is how the railroads in the U.S. were built. Like the libertarians say, oh, we built the railways through private enterprise. Blah, blah, blah. All of those companies had state guarantees. Like they bribed politicians,
Right.
and the politicians passed laws issuing passed laws backing, giving a guarantee by the state of Virginia, whatever,
Yeah.
to a specific company to build a railway. And like this is, minus the bribery, which, it was the 19th century. That's a totally legitimate use of government money, of the borrowing capacity of government at lower interest rate than private sector actors, because it is a 10-year, 20, 30-year process. It's infrastructure. I mean, if you think about all of the other things that the US government borrows money to buy,
Right.
that's certainly the least objectionable um thing. So I guess that's just a sidebar or an aspect of like my broader question, which is why are we talking so much about nuclear now? Okay, because there's going to be all this new demand. Are we going to see new nuclear? Is it just going to be small modular reactors because there's like a legal loophole to get around the NRC, or is it going to be even big nuclear reactors, or what?
There are some people who have been trying for to build, bigger old nuclear reactors, um, and also bring back online some of the currently mothballed reactors. 3 Mile
Yeah.
Island,
Yes.
they are bringing back on one of their units to provide power for Microsoft data centers,
Yes.
I think is the
Yeah.
plan. But most of the excitement, I think, is with smaller reactors,
Yeah.
um, because part of it is regulatory. Um, there's a piece of legislation passed called the Advanced Act, and it's supposed to help provide a more streamlined regulatory approval process for smaller reactors. But then the other thing, traditionally, nuclear power is a rare industry where building nuclear power plants has gotten more expensive over time. Normally, with the technology, when it starts out, it's very expensive. And then as it scales up and evolves, it gets cheaper to make on a
Right.
per unit
Right. Right.
basis. And that hasn't been the true for nuclear plants because they have mostly just all been they, each one has to kind of be designed from scratch for the big light
Yeah.
water reactors. So they're artisanal nuclear power plants. And the hope with the smaller reactors is that
Right. You can mass
you
produce.
can mass produce them, right, and build a lot of parts, assembly line fashion or whatever, and that you'll tap into that cost curve and it will actually come down. So, will that actually work? I have no idea. I'm not that kind of expert, but I think it's an interesting thing to let people try.
All right.
So that's
That's a sort of tepid endorsement.
yes, right. Well, I don't. Yeah,
Um,
it's a tepid. I mean, I don't want to undersell the challenges I think that the field faces, but I also don't want to undersell like the potential for innovation. It was not that long ago, relatively speaking, when everybody just assumed that natural gas was an inherently high cost
right. Yes.
product, and then you had fracking, and suddenly we had tons and tons of gas all over the place,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so that sort of thing can happen. You can't necessarily predict it, and that could you could easily see something like that happening with these smaller reactors with nuclear as well, or not. The other thing is you have
Yes.
sometimes you're in a hype cycle and it pays off. Sometimes you're in a hype cycle and it doesn't pay off. So
Right.
um,
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, we're getting close to our limit, so I'm going to ask you the final question, which is the question we ask every guest, which is recommend a book. It can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, that's outside your area of expertise.
that's outside. Oh, well, that's great. Anything can be outside my area of expertise. I'm reading so I'm currently reading the Stalin. There's that massive doorstop series of Stalin biographies by
Right.
Stephen Kotkin, I think is how you say
Right.
his name.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Kotkin.
yes, and I'm a big fan of that period of history in general, but I sort of
I didn't like the Kotkin Stalin biography. I gave up sometime in the 30s.
okay.
Uh
Well, I'm still in the 20s, so maybe I'll get there.
No, but okay. So what do you like about it?
Yeah. So the first thing I will say is, even though it's a Stalin biography, I've noticed this. This is also true of like the Robert Caro LBJ biographies or whatever. Part of the reason why they get to be so long is because they'll take these like long 100-page detours, to talk about other subjects. Where he's talking about, the
That's such a
and
letdown. Like I was expecting that the LBJ biography was like, oh, and on the morning of May 27, he had eggs. He had two eggs.
right, yeah,
They were
that's right,
they were overdone.
yeah,
He had coffee. He put cream in it.
right.
Oh, that's so disappointing. Okay,
Yeah.
so
There's long sections where, like, even though it's especially early on when Stalin is not doing that much, there's a lot of
right,
stuff that's not about him. But
right.
I think it was one thing that I took away from it, which kind of crystallized some of my early reading, is the extent to which early 20th century Russian politics is really dominated by the peasantry, and especially by the fact that like the peasantry is this huge untapped right wing resource that none of
Yes,
the like right forces are
yes,
willing to like ally with. So
yes.
you have like this natural constituency for like a monarchist, like reactionary.
Slasher.
Yeah, well, yeah, some might call it that.
Well, so
Of course,
you're thinking about the movement of the Black Hundreds.
right? Yes, yeah,
This was a movement known as the Black Hundreds, and they dressed in black shirts, and they had marches with like flags. They had like this whole aesthetic, and it was this idea of like mobilizing the people as one under the charismatic leadership of the czar.
yeah,
It was very proto fascist, and the czarist regime entourage
yeah,
sort of like
right,
they thought they very much in the way that sort of traditional right wingers felt about Hitler in Germany, about Mussolini in Italy. They thought they were sort of cringe working class populists.
right, yes. And even
and they were like, "Get away from me!" And so in that sense, yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
yeah, and even during the Civil War, the whites, they until the very end, they didn't want to do any land reform for the peasants.
Right.
They didn't want to recognize any like regional autonomy, and they even were kind of tepid about like tapping into like monarchist sentiment of like we'll bring back the czar or something like that,
Yeah.
because they were getting a lot of money, I guess, from England. But and of course, the English are very anti-monarchist, as we know. But
For other countries, yes.
yeah, so I mean that's one thing. There are other things that I thought were very insightful in terms of like uh, that period, and I think it also has like larger lessons for
Yeah. I mean, I sort of agree with you with your assessment. Like, it's a very good overview of the period in which it takes place, but I didn't get much of a sense of Stalin the man from reading it,
yeah,
and so I sort of, and that's also, maybe why I sort of gave it up when I did, which is like we were approaching World War II, and I'm like, I already know what goes on in World
yeah,
War II. Like,
yeah,
I don't.
yeah,
Uh, if it's just going to be like one paragraph telling me, oh, Stalin went to this meeting and then this meeting, and then the other paragraph explaining to me that, this is why it's important that Germany wanted to invade Poland. Like, I already know that. So,
yes, yeah,
no, so I actually agree with you. Like, yeah, like the Stalin's early life is a very interesting, like, there's a lot of stuff where you get a sense of the sort of pre-revolutionary Russia.
right,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
And like this stuff about like the Caucasus, which was like the oil boom town of the late 19th century, and like, because it was a boom town, they were sort of like the living and working conditions were for the workers were just absolutely horrid,
right,
and like they didn't have any infrastructure, so the streets were mud, and like people lived in shanty towns
yeah, yeah,
in mud, and so it was horrible. And so he's like, oh well, I understand why, why communism was popular.
right,
But at the same time, it's like, well, like it was actually like tremendous economic growth. Like
right.
that was actually what created that. It was less the sort of traditional sort of feudal
It was very, yeah,
system. It was more the sort of dislocations of like 19th century sort of
right,
hyper capitalism.
right.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Josiah. I will put up your Twitter, X, and everything else. No, seriously, I had a lot of fun. This was extremely interesting. Energy, as the president has said, is like going to be one of the massive priorities of his administration. You're one of the top experts in the country that I read almost certainly every week. I was going to almost every day. Um, so this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good day. Bye.